Hey guys, so anytime I pick up a new deck, I always make the habit of writing down any misplays I make, any illegal plays that I made, unintentionally make, or rather even any general tips. And so I thought at this point I'd bring some random tips regarding branded. And whether you play the deck or you are playing against the deck, I think this video will still be helpful just so that you are aware of certain illegal plays that should not be happening so that you don't get cheated on. So obviously if you're interested in branded stuff, I certainly highly recommend you check out Galzo's channel. I'll link that down below. Definitely sort of the go-to guy for branded content, but for now I'll try my best as well. Alright, so let's just start with the really jank tip, which honestly can actually come up, and it has come up for me if you saw my deck profile. I mentioned this. With Fusion Deployment, obviously the most oftentimes you're going to be revealing Granule to bring out the Cortesia. In some instances when you're going second, you're going to be revealing any of the Albaz Fusion monsters to bring out Albaz. But there are instances where you can technically, if you're playing Dragoon, which most likely you are, you can use this to bring out Dark Magician. And now you might be wondering, why in the world would you do that? Well, it is 2500 attack, so it has definitely come up where it can attack over a 3 material Appaloosa, for example, going second, as well as I've also done it against trying to attack over a Sprite Carrot first, just because that Carrot negate on Branded Fusion is a little too detrimental. So it's a line of play that is technically available. I've actually, even in another instance, I needed a hard way to make Dragoon, just based on the board that my opponent had, and I brought this out with Fusion Deployment because I already had a Cortesia, and with the Serenir in hand, I actually fused into Dragoon using this and the Serenir through Cortesia's effect. So at least you should keep that in mind. So now let's just go over Fusion Duplication that you're probably playing if you're also playing Thrust. And so basically just know that your opponent cannot Ash if you copy Branded Fusion with this, or let's say any other fusion, let's say that involves Graveyard. They also cannot Bell or whatever, and that is because cards like this, which is very essentially similar to Verde Anaconda, where if it is copying a card's effect, it essentially does not gain that effect until at resolution. So that's why your opponent cannot Ash when you copy Branded Fusion, for example, which is very, very nice. And also, let's say something like Super Poly. If you copy Super Poly, then you do not have to discard a card because you are just copying its effect and not the activation requirement. Now, another quick tip about Quem is that, let's just say Quem got impermed, right, and its effects negated. So, let's say in this instance, let's say you use Branded Fusion and you summon Albion. Keep in mind that you can still go Chainlink 1 and then Chainlink 2, attempt to use Quem's effect targeting Cortesia to special, just so you can chain block things to protect your Albion or whatever else in whatever situation you're in that can still try to chain block. So just keep that in mind. You can at least try to attempt to use its effect to protect some of your fusions to go off. Now, still sticking with the Quem example, basically I had one instance where essentially the only playable cards I had was something like this. So not great, obviously, and no access to Branded Fusion, at least not on the turn 1. But, I would do something like, Nadir Servant. You could send something like Lulu, and then you can add something like the Quem. That way you can use Quem's effect to dump something like Branded Fusion. If because in this instance you happen to hard draw Fusion Duplication, you could set that. End phase, this Lulu will summon something like the Cortesia. And so, obviously not a great board at all, but this can still gimmick lock your opponent, for example. So let's say your opponent's turn rolls around. Let's say you let them go into main phase just so you can kind of gimmick lock. But basically, you can do something like this where Fusion Duplication, target the Branded Fusion, you go into Sanctifier, and then you can also essentially bring back, let's say, like Albaz with the Quem effect, and then you can use Cortesia to go into Granule, dump the Gimmick Puppet, and then you can lock your opponent with the Sanctifier effect. Just know that obviously when you dump Branded Fusion and you're setting one, that's pretty suspicious, and it's probably going to give away that your opponent, to your opponent rather, that you have something like Fusion Duplication set. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, your opponent cannot really stop Fusion Duplication anyways, so just some things to keep in mind. And a last quick little thing that I'll mention about Quem is that, if you're playing against Branded and they have a Quem on board, just kind of consider whether it's just worth going into battle phase first and just attacking over this and then proceed with your plays, because this, bringing back something like, let's say, Fallen of Albaz, can really mess up your plays and get rid of not only your extra deck monster, but also they get a Mirror Jade on top of that, which can banish another card and get things going. So just keep that in mind. Maybe consider forcing a battle phase first to get over this Quem if your opponent has one. So random tip about Mercury, by the way, it can actually still negate while it's on the field as well. So just things to keep in mind, because when Quem can revive this back, it actually has some application still, and unfortunately it does not destroy, although some instances maybe it's better that it does not destroy the opponent's monster, but just keep that in mind. Now let's say you hard drew Fallen of Albaz and also something like Super Poly, and your opponent has something that can interact with Albaz, where, you know, discarding a card for cost for Albaz just kind of ends up being pointless, right? Like if your opponent has any kind of like pop or bounce, or let's say a negate and destruction, that really sucks. So in that case, you could always summon Do Not Use effect, declare turn player priority, use this card and just, you know, pitch whatever, and then fuse away like with your opponent's extra deck monster, for example, just so that they never had a chance to respond. But in that instance, I would actually recommend that you just set the Albaz instead, and then turn player priority, Super Poly discard. And the reason for that is because, you know, if you were to summon, even if you were not using its effect, they can still interact with the Solemn Judgment and negate the summon, for example, so that you couldn't get to that point. So you might as well set and do that and get rid of your opponent's monster. Okay, so Branded Lost is obviously a very, very busted card in terms of, you know, not letting your opponent interact on your fusion summons. But just keep that in mind that, you know, the fusion summon has to be Chainlink 1 for this to actually provide that protection where your opponent cannot interact with you. And so where this can kind of come up is something like Branded Red, because it is a quick play spell. So if you ever use this, or let's say your opponent's playing Branded and they ever use this as Chainlink 2 or higher, then their fusion summon, you know, once it's summoned after this, it is actually not protected. Like you can actually respond at that point. So just keep that in mind. It's really, really important, and especially, you know, as a Branded player, you need to know that. And if you're playing against Branded, you really need to know that, because you don't want to get cheated out that way. So just keep that in mind. Alright, so sticking on the topic of the Branded Lost protection, let's just give it a quick example of, you know, how you can do the gimmick lock, where basically your opponent cannot respond to, at least for the most part. So let's say, you know, in your opponent's draw phase, you shotgun that Branded Red. You can target something like a Luber, just fuse into whatever. Essentially, let's just go into Quartus at this point. Not the greatest fusion summon, obviously, but now you can go, let's say, Chainlink 1 Lost. And then you can actually go Chainlink 2 Sanctifier, targeting, let's say in this example, Gimmick and the Albion, and assuming you fusion summon this properly, and that's why you can summon it. And in this instance, your opponent actually cannot respond because you are protected under a Lost. Now, of course, and also with Lost, you can add something like, let's say, Mercury for the monster negate. But let's just say, you know, if your opponent had a Bestial, right? So if essentially, and this is going to be an instance where it's not Magma, because if they had a Magma, they probably would have just done it on your end phase, and you would not get to this point. But let's say if they have a Bestial, or let's say a Call by the Grave, or something like a DD Crow, like when you do Branded in Red, like they essentially kind of have to respond there, right? Because otherwise, you know, again, under that loss protection, they're not going to be able to respond afterwards. And even if they, let's say, Bestial targeting Gimmick Puppet, Call by targeting Gimmick Puppet, at that point, then you can still chain this to give the Gimmick Puppet to your opponent, and then you can, I don't know, summon something else. And so you can still kind of work around that, and just gives you like two layers essentially to be able to get this Gimmick Lock off. Now, as I mentioned, again, you know, if your opponent had Bestial on your end phase, this is where that kind of goes south. Also, there's a downside to this play, because you are essentially shotgunning the Branded in Red, and essentially you're kind of burning the opportunity to go into like something like Guardian Chimera and pop some back row that your opponent might set, and that can really backfire when you're facing against certain decks that can play something like Rivalry of Warlords, or even worse, Grave of the Super Ancient Organism, where honestly, even if they get Gimmick Lock and they set that going second and flip it against you, it can be really devastating. So you do have to be careful with this line of play. It's a little bit greedy when you are shotgunning the Branded in Red, just so that you can secure that Gimmick Lock to go off, but the play is there. I think maybe sticking with Branded Red just a little bit longer is that just keep in mind, whatever you summon off of this thing, it cannot attack directly that same turn. So that can definitely come up if like you thought you had the game, but then you realize you cannot actually attack directly with it, and that's something you need to keep in mind against Branded players, so that you don't accidentally lose when you shouldn't have. The other thing is though, because, you know, that fusion summon monster cannot attack directly, but if you were to get into a Lubellion, for example, then you can use this effect to just shuffle that, like let's say Albus back and whatever other you banish, just to summon something else, and then you can attack directly with that instead. So that at least gives you an external, another way of just getting another body on board that can actually attack. Now, another thing I want to mention about Branded Red is that, you know, when I first started playing Branded, I sort of had this bad habit of sometimes if I had Fallen of Albaz, I would go into a light monster. I would just go into Albion the Shrouded Dragon instead, because I'm like, oh, awesome, this is better, because, you know, I don't have to pitch, and, you know, in a late game situation, you might not have that much hand advantage. But at the same time, because you're banishing that Albaz, for example, and the light monster to summon this, now when you try to use its fusion effect, you might not have a Fallen of Albaz left in your grave or your hand, and so, you know, whatever Mirror J you were trying to summon isn't going to go very well. So always just keep that in mind. You know, just keep that in mind. Your Albaz is getting banished, so just see whether you actually have anything worthy fusion summoning with Albion Dragon when you're bringing it out. Now another random thing is branded banishment. Now most branded lists do not actually play this anymore, but if you are going against this, just make sure to remember that this can actually only summon a level 8 or higher fusion summon monster, okay? So even though people kind of read this as super poly, they can't just like make Garura or Mud Dragon with this, because those are, it's like level 6 and level 4 and whatever. So it has to be level 8 or higher, so keep that in mind. Now let's just cover a random tip about Shrouded Dragon. Now for the most part, you're obviously using its effect while this is in your hand. Dump something like Retribution, put this at the bottom of your deck and draw one. But you know what, sometimes you kind of hard draw this card, which for the most part ends up being pretty bad. And let's say you just really need a way to get this to grave, because it's just your only way to getting access to Branded Fusion through the grave. So you can actually always dump this card, pitch this card rather, from your hand to special this either while it's in your hand or while it's in your graveyard. So that effect is there. It's seldom used, and I've actually done it before because I was under rivalry, and this is actually a dragon, and the 2500 attack, and you have all your other branded dragons. It's actually pretty high, especially including Lubellion too. The other thing though is that while it is treated as a Fallen of Albaz on the field and grave, obviously it's not actually treated as Fallen of Albaz when it's in the hand. So definitely something to keep in mind of, especially if you're playing against branded. Don't get cheated that way. If you, let's say, add this off of branded red, because then at that point, in the grave, it is Fallen of Albaz. But then if you try to use this as consider it as Fallen of Albaz when they fusion summon with branded red while this is in your hand, definitely cannot do that. It is only treated as Fallen of Albaz on the field and in the grave. Okay, now some other tips for random tips for branded extra deck monsters is let's say with Mirror Jade, and you're going against something like a Psychic End Punisher, where it's essentially like unaffected by like your opponent's activated effects. What you can always do is like you can crash into Psychic End Punisher, and hopefully you don't actually die there, and then you declare its effect to nuke the field at the end phase, and that effect will actually still go through, and it will get rid of the Mirror Jade, because at that point, for some reason, I'm not sure if it's the best wording, but it's essentially not considered as like an activated effect anymore. So it will still get rid of that Psychic End Punisher or monsters similar to Psychic End Punisher. So always keep that in mind of that kind of Mirror Jade nuke effect. Another random thing to mention about Sanctifier, obviously it's really good that it cannot be used as fusion material, and that can actually kind of come up sometimes in the mirror. Let's say, I don't know, in some instance that came up for me was that, like a Rimbrum effect that's about to bring out the Albaz, so that fusion summon is coming, and I was able to just get rid of kind of like my monsters, where I essentially only had this on the field, and then that way, your opponent could not fuse it away with their Albaz. So just some things to keep in mind. This card is really strong. Another random tip about Rimbrum is that remember that you can only use this effect on your opponent's turn to special something like Fallen of Albaz in the grave. So if you're playing against a branded player, definitely don't get cheated. I definitely made that mistake unintentionally when I first started playing this deck, where I would try to do this on my own turn just to go for game. So you cannot do that, only on your opponent's turn. And then last random little tip with featuring Dragoon is that let's say you already use like Dragoon's effect, you can always go like Kertija, let's say use these two to summon that Dragostapelia, and then using Adled's effect you can actually bring back the Dragoon, and for some reason Dragoon is a soft once per turn, which means it's a negate. It will be live again this turn, although keep in mind that now at this point this Dragoon cannot pop your opponent's monster because essentially normally you use Dark Magician as fusion material, right? But at this point it would not be treated as using that as fusion material, so it will not be able to pop, but at least you do still get the negate back. And now one last random tip, which has nothing to do with branded but just related to Dragoon that I'm seeing way too often, is that if this pops the Nibiru token, it will not deal burn damage to your opponent. So just keep that in mind, because that's obviously, if you let that go through, like you're gonna have like a lot of easy wins, and you don't want to cheat your opponent that way. Alright guys, so that was it for some of the random branded tips, misplays, illegal plays, and what have you. And so hopefully you found that useful and helpful if you are playing against branded, or if you're playing branded yourself. And so as always, a big thanks to all of you for watching the video. A big thanks to my Patreons for supporting the channel as always, and well, take care guys.